I call Darian Fenton.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I've been fascinated hearing about the select committee process on this bill because, and particularly because the member, David Bennett, is a member of this committee, and I'm hoping that he'll learn quite a lot about how you can make changes that actually improve workers' rights when we come to consider the draconian employment law legislation in front of our the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee. In my first reading speech, I said there were some good things in this bill and there were some things that we were concerned about. Some of them have been cleaned up, and I'm particularly pleased that we have got to a position with the redundancy provisions for state sector employees where the union, public service union is comfortable with it, although they do have commented that there's no doubt that there's more restraints being imposed on redundancy compensation. But they, compared to the original proposal, certainly made some ground. And I noted also, Mr Speaker, that Jonathan Coleman, the Minister, when he was in his second reading speech, talked about redundancy being about fairness. Now, I'm quite confused about that, actually. It seems that redundancy is about fairness when it comes to this bill, but it's not about fairness when it comes to Sue Moroney's bill, which is the employment protection, which would provide redundancy fairness for private sector workers as well as public sector workers. And also, it seems this is about fairness when it comes to situations, which of course I support, in the public service where workers are being transferred from one position to another, and there are many rights that have been cleaned up in this bill and totally support those. But when it comes to transferring low-paid cleaners or low-paid kitchen workers or low-paid orderlies or laundry workers that work in the private sector or even who work in hospitals employed by contractors under Part 6A of the Employment Relations Bill, fairness doesn't apply. Because actually what the government wants to do is take away their rights, or the rights for workers who are actually employed by small employers. The second thing I wanted to mention, Mr Speaker, is around the issue of workplace orders. And again, this is something I understand took a lot of negotiation and a lot of consideration, and perhaps is an exemplar about how you can reach agreement, how select committees can reach agreement and make progress on a bill that's important to everyone. Originally, the bill allowed for government to use orders in council to intervene in collective bargaining between the union and the employer and, for example, prevent the employer agreeing to a pay rise. Now, it's really pleasing that the Select Committee has dropped this provision, and instead the new bill allows the State Services Commissioner to issue workforce policy statements, but these specifically exclude pay and conditions. But as my colleague David Parker warned earlier, though, there are consequences, there are knock-on effects, and the knock-on effect of the government's other legislation, the Employment Relations Amendment Bill, will have a knock-on effect in the state sector, and it will have while the State Services Commission won't be able to interfere with collective bargaining, the government's legislation around collective bargaining in another bill will have enormous impact on state sector workers, and we'll see how that goes. But under that bill, employers won't have to negotiate a collective agreement. So they can just say, well, we don't want to, and so it's going to be harder to negotiate a pay rise, let alone protection for people who work in the state sector and the public sector who may be in a situation where they're trying to bargain for a pay rise or to keep their current terms and conditions as they have to do at the moment because this government's been so mean. But also, under those provisions, new workers can be paid less. So having a collective agreement is one thing, but being able to bring in new workers and pay them less under the government's other legislation will actually undermine this bill, will undermine the provisions in this bill around collective agreements. There are other provisions that I could talk about, but I won't. What I would say is I find it very interesting, two things very interesting. One is that we have a select committee process where there seems to be agreement across the board, albeit with some reservations on our side, about the rights of workers to redundancy and collective bargaining. But then on the other hand, another select committee is about to completely undermine those provisions for all workers.
I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The previous speaker